Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Hello, welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm Stephen Braude, Professor and Chair of Philosophy here at UMBC. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce a friend of mine, John Rennie Short, Professor of Public Policy at UMBC. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
John, you have unusually broad interests and areas of expertise. You're an authority on urban issues, environmental concerns, globalization, political geography, and also the history of cartography. Anything else that I should mention?
No, I think that covers most of my interests, I think.
Well, tell us something about your background.
Yes, you can tell by my accent. I wasn't born in the United States. I was born in central Scotland. I went to the University of Aberdeen to initially study Scottish literature, but changed to geography. Graduated and then went to graduate school at the University of Bristol. Did postdoctoral research, and then was employed as what you would call an assistant professor at the University of Reading. And then in 1990, I was appointed as a full professor at Syracuse University in upstate New York. And I came to UMBC, as we call it, in 2002.
Now, by my count, you've written or co-authored 33 books. Is that about right?
That's right. I was reminded a comment by John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist. He said when he was under 40, he found it very difficult to write. But when he was over 40, he found it difficult to stop. Now, clearly, both over 40 and finding it difficult to stop.
Well, I was thinking maybe you need to ramp up your productivity
a
little bit. You don't want to be a slacker. Your two most recent books are Cartographic Encounters, published by the University of Chicago Press, and also Cities and Nature, published by Routledge. Let's talk about those for a few minutes. Can we start with Cities and Nature?
Yes, yes.
It looks like these are two quite distinct themes. How do they relate?
It's interesting that they're normally considered separate, and that's been one of the divisions in the discussions and the popular understanding, indeed in the social science literature. On the one hand, we have nature, wilderness, preservation of the so-called natural environment. And the urban is seen as somehow profane, not natural environment. And what we've tried to do in this book is to bring together a large number of studies, including our own, that bring together this ecological perspective, but focused in on the city. The city is the major environment for the majority of the world's population. Most people live in cities.
And you see intimate relationships between the cities and the environment, ecological relationships?
Yes, very much. Standard thing, for example, central cities are at least 2 to 5 degrees warmer than suburban areas. There's something called the urban heat island. Cities actually impact local climates. They affect and influence local climates. They also change the habitat. It's not simply a case that urban areas demolish all ecosystems. Sometimes certain species, for example, do quite well. Hawks do quite well in central Manhattan, for example, strangely enough.
So you want to interpret cities as part of the larger environment. You don't want to separate the cities off from
Exactly. We want to see that both, in one hand, we want to see the cities as part of the ecological processes, the biogeochemical cycles, and part of our understanding of the environment. And the same way, we also want to look at the environment as also a social phenomenon. Give you one example. Often we use the term natural disasters, often when they apply to cities. For example, Katrina in New Orleans. Well, in closer inspection, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Disasters affect some societies more than others, some cities more than others, and some people in cities more than others. Physical elements are mediated through social differences, political systems. There's really no such thing as a natural disaster. There are really much more environmental impacts in specific places.
So there must be political ramifications about this book.
Yes, very much, in the sense of we can only understand the urban and the environment through an understanding of political and economic arrangements.
Well, how would our attitudes or policies toward pollution, for example, be affected by the perspective you're taking in this book?
For example, one of the biggest pollutions we have in the United States is the large amount of garbage and waste. We have a huge waste stream, as it's referred to. That's obviously connected to the forms of consumption, the packaging, the excessive packaging often. Compare this with many other parts of the world. So pollution levels are not separate from economic systems or individual consumption patterns. There's a connection between society and the environment, between social issues and environmental issues, and that's one of the main themes of the book.
Let's talk for a few minutes about your other new book, Cartographic Encounters. What does that title mean?
Cartographic Encounters, it's not someone else has used the phrase before, in fact many people. It really refers to the collaboration between explorers and indigenous people. In other words, map making, for example, done by early explorers into North America and subsequently the United States, they weren't doing it on their own. There was an encounter with indigenous people which was central to the maps that were made and the geographical understandings that were produced.
And how did you find that out? I assume that the indigenous people didn't have written records of these encounters, so you must have gotten this information somewhere.
Well, strangely enough, I went back to the original sources. You're correct. We don't have a good record of indigenous people. Often they're non-literate societies, they're oral culture, and we've lost many of their stories. But the explorers, for example, John Smith, the early English explorer in Virginia, or Charles Fremont, exploring in the western areas of the United States in the 19th century, often would keep very meticulous diaries and records. Over the years, people have ignored these, and they tend to then do the very quick summary of, exploration with the great men theory. But if you actually go back and really read their journals, they're very revealing about their use of native informants, as they called them, on their use of maps made by indigenous people. Often these maps would be made on the ground, in the snow, on birch, and we now have a very good record of these. So if you go back to the journals and really read the journals in their entirety, I can see why people don't do that. They tend to read the Cliff Note versions. But if you go back to the originals, you see how totally reliant they were on indigenous informants. I did this for both the United States and indeed for Australia. There's one chapter in the book in Australia, and it's a similar pattern. I could have done the same with the English in Africa or in India. There's this recurring pattern of when people arrive in a country, these weren't blank spaces. They were populated, inhabited by people. And these people had incredible geographical knowledge and often a very sophisticated map-making ability. And these were used by newcomers, the new migrants, the new explorers, the new invaders, if you want.
I'm a little surprised to learn that this must be a novel position to be taking. I'm surprised that scholars in your area haven't made something of this in the past.
I think because the history of exploration has really been written from just one side. It's really been a celebratory achievement of certain explorers. More recently, there's been a criticism of them, so that now we've looked at their psychology, their sexual orientation, in order to kind of like identify them as having feet of clay. I'm not concerned with that. I'm actually concerned with the collaboration that was involved. It was a kind of joint enterprise. Now, something was gained and something was lost. The Native Americans would often give information for a reason. They wanted the trade goods. They wanted the military power associated with the Europeans coming, for example. And they gave up their geographical knowledge in return for trade goods, political alliances. But ultimately they lost. I refer to it as a collusion that ended in tragedy, because by giving up geographical information, they essentially gave away their power. So they lost something from this encounter, this collaboration.
So you're making conjectures about a side of the story that we can only infer from the one side that was actually written
True,
down.
it's very kind of biased, but my argument is if I'm only getting the story from one side, the side that wasn't the indigenous people, and if they mention indigenous people, think how you would get the story if you really did get the indigenous side. In other words, I'm going to the least sympathetic account of the indigenous people and still discovering a huge amount of indigenous involvement. And by indigenous, I mean by local people.
Right.
And we know some of that. For example, the Lewis and Clark, it's well known that they relied on various informants. But almost every Western exploration was almost, in some cases, almost totally reliant. I tell the story of Charles Fremont, who couldn't leave a US Army fort without hiring first a guide, a native guide, a man called Tai Kai Bull. Every exploration that left a certain part of the United States needed this guide, wanted this guide. And you can read in their accounts about how they would want this guide and how they'd be unhappy if they were palmed off with a secondary guide and how much they would pay. It's totally revealing. What struck me was almost a sort of surprise that no one had looked at these sources before in quite this way. I really was almost shocked by that. Pleasantly shocked, because it meant it was a new area for me to write about.
So much else is passed down in the indigenous cultures from one generation to the next. I'm surprised that more information isn't apparently passed down about these encounters with we have
a record in a way. Often the cartographic encounters took place in and through maps. So you can actually follow the patterns of indigenous map makers through subsequent more European, more US maps. In other words, there's a sort of underground cartographic architecture that once you know what you're looking for, you can identify very clearly the reliance on river systems. So if you look at French maps of the 18th century of the interior of what is now the United States, it's dominated by river systems. So why is that? Well, the reason is because the Native Americans moved around through the rivers. They had a very sophisticated knowledge of how the river basin kind of connected. And so French maps, directly following on from their work, have this incredibly intricate hydrological mapping, which they wouldn't know of themselves. So why do we have this sophisticated hydrology? It's really because of that. So that was the main interstate for the Native Americans. They knew about it, and that's what they did in their maps, which the French copied down and annotated. And sometimes some French maps would often say written with the aid of a certain informant. We actually have that in a number of maps, which I mentioned. Famous one is of a big map of the whole Western Territory. It was done by a member of the Blackfoot tribe, whose work was written down by a man called Peter Fiddler, and he actually wrote down the map that this informant actually did in the snow, probably. And so we now have a record of these things. So in other words, the maps, even contemporary maps, have this underground architecture of Native American, just in the same way as we have a linguistic backdrop, in the sense of Manhattan is named after native peoples, and the whole Connecticut, Massachusetts. The same way we have this linguistic layer, we also have a cartographic layer that once you're aware of, you can see, and that's what I tend to do in the book, try to uncover this contribution which we now have forgotten about.
Now, this book only deals with certain parts of the world. Does that mean there'll be a place for a second edition or a second version of?
Could be, yeah. I'm just mainly dealing with North America, because I deal with Canada and then the United States. And there's one chapter in Australia, just to show that it's not a distinctly North American thing. But there's clearly room for a whole body of work to be done, and perhaps once I finish a couple of projects, I may come back to that again. I just found it fascinating because I love looking at and reading the journals. They're very revealing. People tell you about their deepest fears. They're often, they can be poetic at times about the physical landscape, about the people, the indigenous people. And they're also very revealing about the drama that goes on with these explorations and mapping expeditions. So they're enormously rewarding to read them. They still speak to us today.
I'm sure it's a very interesting book. Do you have a website where you can get information about this book and all your others.
Yes, I do. The website is easy to remember. It's johnrennieshort.com. And I also have a blog, which is johnrennieshort.blogspot.com.
Well, John, we've enjoyed speaking with you today. We've been visiting with John Rennie Short, Professor of Public Policy at UMBC. John, thanks for joining us today at UMBC.
Thank you very much, Dave. Hello, everyone. My name is John Rennie Short. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where we are today. And I'm speaking with a colleague and good friend, Stephen Braude, professor of philosophy. He's also chair of the department. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're going to speak about Steve's new book, The Gold Leaf Lady. But first of all, I'd like to find out more about you, Steve.
Well, it's a sordid and complicated tale. I started innocently enough. Academically, I was doing work in philosophy at the intersection of philosophical logic, the philosophy of time, and the philosophy of language. And I was busy writing a dissertation on temporal logic. And in those days, I fancied myself to be a kind of hard-nosed materialist. Not for any particularly good reason. It was just a kind of intellectual conceit I was cultivating in those days. And it was a slow day in Northampton, Massachusetts, and some friends came over. We'd seen the only movie in town, and they said, let's play this game called Table Up. What they meant was, let's have a seance. And I knew nothing about psychical research, and frankly, neither did my friends, but they said they'd played this game a few times, and when it worked, it was great fun. So, to my great surprise and horror, actually, for the next 3 hours, I watched my table rise in the air and spell out answers in response to the questions. Now, I'm sure people listening to this, many of them anyway, must be saying to themselves, yeah, right. And frankly, there's no way I can describe this that will quell all of their skeptical concerns. But I will say that it was broad daylight, it was my house, it was my table. My friends were not practical jokers. I'm not even sure they had a sense of humor.
They were philosophers, after all.
Yes, they were, that's right. I probably should mention we weren't stoned. And in fact, if one of my friends got up to leave the room, the table continued to rise under our fingers. We could be standing next to the table, and the table would rise under our fingers. We clearly were not lifting it with our legs. It made a great impression on me, as you can imagine, but I felt I couldn't really discuss this with my mentors. And I was focused on getting my PhD and getting a job. So I literally put the event out of mind until I finished my PhD, I got a job and got tenure. And then with the alleged comfort afforded by academic freedom, I decided I really needed to come to grips with this thing that had happened back in grad school. And I knew that some well-known philosophers had looked carefully at the data of psychical research, and so I read what they had to say. And I decided, after all, there was something here worth sinking my teeth into. And then I decided if I was going to do a responsible job of that, I needed to become a member of the community of scientists and scholars looking carefully at the evidence.
Was this a difficult thing to do, in the sense, given the hard-nosed nature of much of your previous philosophical research?
It certainly went against the grain, but I felt it would have been dishonest intellectually to do otherwise. So I'm now about as much of an insider as it's possible to be in that community. I'm past president of the Parapsychological Association, which is an affiliate organization of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'm currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration. And I've written a bunch of books. And when I started all of this, when I started down this path after doing more or less mainstream work in philosophy of language and philosophy of logic, I first tackled the experimental evidence in parapsychology and wrote a book about that and the philosophical implications of all of that. And I still had a pretty disdainful view of the non-experimental evidence. I assumed that if there was good, sustainable evidence for psychical phenomena, that it would have to come from the lab. I didn't realize at the time that most of the people who had perpetuated the view that the non-experimental evidence was not worthwhile really didn't know what that evidence was, and I had, like they probably, had just accepted it uncritically. So I was surprised and again horrified to discover that this evidence was much better than people made it out to be. And so I wrote another book on the non-experimental evidence, mostly having to do with large-scale psychokinesis. The book was called The Limits of Influence.
So the Gold Leaf Lady book is a continuation of a large body of work conducted over a long number of years.
Yes, it was a long and winding path. I mean, I wrote 2 other books before that, one about multiple personality, which turned out to be relevant to all of this. I wrote it because I was interested in material and the philosophy of mind and the unity of consciousness. But I also knew that at some point in my life, when I became more chronologically challenged, I would want to write a book on the evidence for survival of bodily death. And I also knew that the evidence from dissociation and multiple personality looked a lot like what we see in cases of mediumship or channeling. And so I knew that if I was ever going to write a book on the evidence for life after death, I needed to know something about the history of psychiatry and dissociation and hypnosis. And so that led to a book called First Person Plural. And then finally I wrote a book on life after death called Immortal Remains. But by that time, I was old enough to collect Social Security, and I figured, well, it's time for a memoir. And The Gold Leaf Lady is really that. It's about some of my more interesting personal case investigations.
Let's begin with the title, The Gold Leaf Lady. Who is the Gold Leaf Lady?
The Gold Leaf Lady is a woman in Florida, now in her mid to late 50s. She's a functionally illiterate woman who works as basically a domestic. And she seems to be a good all-round psychic. She works with the police on solving of crimes. She seems to be a medium or a channel. Some people say she's a healer, though she wasn't able to do anything about what she calls my landing strip. And spontaneously, and apparently out of her control, her body breaks out in what looks like gold leaf. I could be sitting this close to her, and suddenly something would appear on her face or on her hands.
So you've actually been there when what looked like gold leaf broke out?
Yes, I've seen it quite a few times, and in fact there's quite a lot of first-hand testimony from others who've also seen it. I mean, for example, people holding her hand at one point, and then suddenly her arm will break out in large quantities of this material. Now, I've investigated her on a number of occasions. I've been to see her with magicians. Magicians have confirmed that the material, which we can just scrape off her and handle and examine, it's very difficult to manipulate.
So you're using magicians as a test case for subterfuge or...
Sure, it's always a live question whether this woman, whose name is Katie, is really just a skilled conjurer of some kind. And the magicians I've worked with have all concluded that the material is much too difficult to work with. And besides, the stuff appears right in front of people's eyes after her body has been carefully examined. It's not as if she has some nearby stash of foil that she can dip into. Now, the foil, it turns out, is not gold, unfortunately. It turns out to be brass. I've had it analyzed here at UMBC. I've had it analyzed at Johns Hopkins Material Science Department, University of Denver, a number of other places. It seems to be, in all other respects, perfectly normal rolled brass leaf. That's often called Dutch metal or composition leaf.
And it's breaking out from her skin.
Breaks out from her skin.
Wow.
Yes. It looks like it's...
I'm lost for words in the sense.
I understand. It looks like some people describe it as she's sweating it or exuding it, but I think that's actually not what's going on. I mean, part of what's intriguing about the case is that it's not clear exactly how to classify the phenomenon. I mean, there's a fairly complex taxonomy of psychical phenomena, and the two most obvious candidates would be, first, materialization, where objects apparently appear out of nothing. The problem is, for all the evidence there is of ostensible materializations, materialized phenomena usually dematerialize. They don't hang around for very long.
So they disappear.
Katie's foil stays there. I have large quantities of it. And the other option would be something that's called an apport, where in many poltergeist cases, for example, objects will disappear from one location and appear somewhere else. Now, if that's what's going on, it's not clear whose body of composition leaf is being rated for all the stuff to appear on Katie.
It seems a fascinating case, but you have others as well. Would you like to discuss any of the other case studies in your book?
I will mention one. I came in at the end of a career of a person named Ted Sirios, who produced what's known as thoughtographs. He could apparently impress images by thinking about it on Polaroid, instant Polaroid film. He was investigated very carefully in the 1960s by psychiatrist Jewel Eisenbud. And I'm pleased to say that the UMBC Library, Special Collections, has the entire body of Sirius's work with Eisenbud and the entire Eisenbud material on parapsychology. So it's there for people to investigate.
Fascinating. Any other case studies you'd like to discuss?
Well, so the others in the Gold Leaf Lady are a little more difficult to discuss. They're often cautionary tales. Some of them were unsuccessful attempts to observe psychic phenomena with various subjects. One, because I think he was a fraud, and I believe I caught him cheating. Another, because I think he was psychologically trampled on by one of his investigators. So I think that's a cautionary tale about the delicacy of the psychological conditions necessary for eliciting good phenomena with the subject.
I've read the book. I enjoyed it tremendously. One of the things that struck me about it was the very careful path you tread between skepticism, looking to see if things were above board, but also a sort of healthy regard for open-eyed truth. I mean, often you speak at various places, or write various places about almost the ideology of scientific rationalists who will not look at data and truth when it's there if it doesn't meet their paradigm.
I've found at least two major kinds of closed-mindedness since I started investigating parapsychological data. There are lovers of the miraculous who accept everything uncritically, and there are those who reject everything uncritically. And it seems to me the world is generally a lot stranger than most people appreciate. And if we've learned anything from the history of science, it's that humankind is not a very good judge of the empirically possible. The world usually turns out to be more interesting than each generation thinks it is.
I always, the strangeness of the word, I mean, if you go to theoretical physics, if you read anything in theoretical physics, it presents a world of multi-dimensions, of numerous particles that can never be seen. It's a strange, exotic world, and its subatomic reality. So it seems that a lot of the work that you're doing is taking that open-eyed truth look at what's happening in our everyday lives.
I hope that's right. I mean, I've met some closed-minded physicists about this, but on the whole, I would say that physicists who deal with a level of strangeness that we don't find in other sciences are, on the whole, more open to paranormal research than, say, members of the social sciences, who are often already defensive about the scientific status of their disciplines.
Now, are you still hunting ghosts, still looking for parapsychological phenomenon?
When cases come my way, I usually turn down opportunities to investigate hauntings because most of the time you sit around and wait for something to happen and then nothing happens. Often enough, if you want a phenomenon to go away, bring in a parapsychologist. That's almost guaranteed to kill it. And it might come as no surprise that the philosophy department doesn't have provisions in its budget for paranormal case investigations. So I have to use my time wisely. Either I have to ride on media's coattails, which I've done sometimes, or I have to fund it myself, or I have to wait for funding. But yes, I'm hoping to get some funding to investigate some so-called sitter groups in Europe at the moment where they're getting table levitations and apparent materializations.
All right. Now, if we want to find out more about your work, do you have a website?
I do. Actually, I have a university website, and the web address is so complicated that unless you're a URL savant, you'll never remember it. So I have also a whimsical website, jazzphilosopher.com, and you'll find links on jazzphilosopher.com to my UMBC website, and you can get information on my books and articles and download some of them.
Now, often people are continuing on work or taking new paths in their work. Where do you stand immediately after the Gold Leaf Lady's been published?
Well, I've taken on editorship of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, which is, I'm discovering a challenge that I hadn't anticipated.
Is that available on online? Or?
Past issues are available online for downloading. Otherwise, you have to join the Society for Scientific Exploration, and you can attend annual conferences and get hard copies of the journal. And as I said, I'm hoping to continue to investigate weird phenomena wherever they crop up.
Well, Steve, thank you very much for an informative and enlightening look at the paranormal and parapsychology in a really good book, The Gold Leaf Lady. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Think forward. Think Research Channel.